So welcome. So this is just the header for that, right? And then to go to the next space, I see what you're saying, but it really is to center this. So this is just a very short video that will frame our thinking. And so let me mute my.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to The Human Perspective. My name is Judy Heumann. I am a 73-year-old white disabled woman who uses a motorized wheelchair that you can't see. I am wearing red glasses and I have on silver Mexican dangling earrings with the blouse that my husband brought me from Mexico, which is white with flowers and other colors that go around the neck of the blouse. And we are, as usual, in the foyer of our apartment, surrounded by lots of different pictures and graphics and plants, and very happy to be with you all today. I'd like to introduce Anna Landre, who will be moderate with me today. We are very privileged that she is working with us this summer. They recently graduated from Georgetown University. And would you please give us your image description?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Landre. I'm a 22-year-old white woman with brown hair that reaches about to my shoulder. I'm wearing a white shirt. I have on 2 silver necklaces, and I'm sitting right next to Judy, also in my power chair, but you also can't see it.
And Lydia, welcome to the show. And could you start out, please, giving us your image description?
This is Lydia. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses. Today, I'm wearing a zippered pullover, and it says GLTR on it. I have a necklace, and behind me is a blurred room.
It's great to have Lydia with us today. Lydia, you know that you are known by many as a thought leader and one who says what you believe. On some level, I think of you as a provocateur in the most positive of ways. In saying what you believe, it really allows people to learn about ways people think about some of the current problems that disabled people and society in general are dealing with. So welcome very much, Lydia, for being with us today. Could you please share with us a bit about who you are? And you have so many interests, but what some of those interests are. And also, are there things that you're working on right now that you'd like to share with us?
This is Lydia. I've been a community organizer, an advocate, a policy expert, and recently a lawyer, and an advocate within the disabled community for more than 10 years. Currently, I work full-time doing policy advocacy, and I also teach as adjunct faculty at Georgetown and American universities. My work focuses particularly on addressing interpersonal and state violence that harms disabled people, especially disabled people who live at the margins of the margins. My work is focused on intersections of disability with race, class, queerness, gender, sexuality, faith, language, and nation, among other intersections of systems of domination and oppression. I'm working on a number of different projects right now, and I don't really know, what would be the best to talk about, but I do work in a number of different spheres, and I always have. I work at the crossroads and the nexus of disability studies work, of policy advocacy, of community organizing and community building and teaching.
Could you just for a moment discuss a little bit more about those who are living on the margin? What that means to you for the audience to understand.
When we talk about ableism, which is disability oppression, it's very easy for most people to think of that as a very siloed conversation. You are disabled, you experience disability discrimination and perhaps prejudice, and therefore in addressing ableism, we address the condition of disabled people. But the reality is that ableism itself cannot be disentangled from or separated from understanding other forms of oppression, domination, and marginalization. Ableism is itself both necessary for and dependent upon every other form of oppression. And the way that oppression works, often, just as it does for disabled people, is by teaching us that it's an individual problem, that the onus of solving oppression either lies with the kind-heartedness of decent people with privilege, or on marginalized people to somehow pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and overcome it. And in both cases, those narratives serve to render invisible the mechanisms and the structures of how oppression actually works. And so ableism works in ways that mirror and are in tandem with many other forms of oppression, whether that is white supremacy, capitalism, settler colonialism, misogyny, transmesia, or queermesia, just to name a few. When we talk about disabled people who live at the margins of the margins, we mean disabled people who face the compounded, amplified, and exacerbated impact of multiple forms of oppression in our lives. When we talk about disabled people who live at the margins of the margins, we're talking about disabled people who face the compounded impact of oppression and marginalization in multiple forms. The ways in which different forms of oppression add together are cumulative, create particular and pernicious impacts. We're talking about disabled people who face not just ableism as predicated upon assumptions about bodies and brains, but disabled people who also face the brunt of racism, of classism, of anti-queer oppression, of caste-based oppression, of religious-based oppression. We're talking about what happens when disabled people live real lives, which is a recognition that not a single one of us inhabits only a single category of identity or existence. Audre Lorde, who was also disabled, as well as being a queer, feminist, Black scholar, taught us there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. The work that I do, therefore, seeks to challenge and upend the assumption that when we talk about disability or disability advocacy, we're always inferring that that means only the most privileged people within the disability community. Instead, my work serves to prioritize and center the work, the brilliance, the wisdom, the struggle, the freedom fight, the community building, the innovation of disabled people who face the most impact of marginalization and oppression.
Lydia, was there one or two people in your life when you were younger who helped spur this thinking from you? And maybe you were listening to conversations that others were having. What was it that at such a young age, I don't want to use the word motivated, because obviously you're internally motivated, but are there people that you think of in your family or outside of your family who had a similar vision of justice and injustice?
I don't know how to answer that question. There kind of wasn't.
I think that's even more astounding, really.
I think that's a testament to why you're such an amazing figure in the disability justice movement. Like when we were going to have you on, our whole office here was was just extremely excited to have you on as a guest because of your vision of the world, a world that's anti-ableist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist. And I think another great thing for you to talk about would be what disability justice offers us as a framework, as in some ways building upon the disability rights movement and bringing us into a second disability movement or just a deepening of it.
This is Lydia. As a child, people in my life didn't articulate their concerns about justice or injustice in any of the ways that I do, or in ways that might be recognizable in the same way that we're talking about it now. But for my entire life, the people who I gravitated to as friends were also people who were marginalized. Many people who I was friends with as a child, whether in elementary school or middle school, at my actual school, or I met them somewhere else, in the library, on the street, in some other program, have turned out, I've now learned in adulthood, also came out as queer or trans, have also realized they're disabled or chronically ill, or they were diagnosed as disabled at a young age, but they never told anybody. But I know about it now. And I don't think that was an accident. Even if many of us weren't necessarily talking about what is just or unjust until about middle school, that was happening. All of my friends were people who were concerned about justice or injustice. All of my friends were concerned about oppression and about what was wrong in society. But prior to then, we didn't have to necessarily be talking about it to know about it, because it was present in all of our lives, experiencing with our families, in our own lives, what we witnessed, where we went to school or where we lived. Injustice is evident because the society we live in right now is profoundly unjust. The society we live in now is unspeakably and indescribably violent. And so I don't have a good answer to that question you asked me earlier, because how I was raised and where I grew up was just so different in a landscape from the spaces that I occupy now, especially because I was raised in a fundamentalist evangelical Christian church. And that's not a space where I would generally ever feel welcome as who I am right now. But it was a space that was basically the extension of my family when I was a young child, because that's how I grew up. So that question is very hard to answer.
But that was a brilliant answer.
But in thinking about expanding or changing a framework to disability justice rather than disability rights, I would say that also reflects ways in which my thinking and my understanding of myself have changed too. When I was first involved with disability advocacy, I was only doing disability rights-based work because that's all I knew. And that's all that was available to me at the time. And frankly, it's kind of a miracle, and many of us will attest to that I knew anything about disability advocacy before the age of 18, because a lot of disabled people didn't encounter disability activism, advocacy, or organizing until well into adulthood because of the pervasive erasure of disabled narratives and anti-ableist resistance. But when I encountered disability advocacy, it was presented in a very solidly rights-based framework. And that's what guided my work for many years. And as I have learned and grown a lot from many other people, leaders, writers, organizers within disability and disabled communities, I have shifted my framework entirely over the past decade to that where a commitment to disability justice shapes and undergirds all of the work that I do. And some of the people who've been instrumental that I have learned from include Mia Mingus, Talila Lewis, Leah Lakshmi Kepchno Samara Singha, Eli Clare, Aurora Levins Morales, and Patricia Byrne, just to name a few of the people who've been doing disability justice work, whose work has taught me, that I have learned from, whose work has shaped the way that I do my own work. And I believe very much that the disability community has no future unless that future is rooted in disability justice. You see, the difference is that disability rights teaches us that to change the social condition of disabled people requires us to transform laws and policies. If we can reform existing laws, enforce our existing laws, strengthen our existing laws, repeal harmful laws, and pass better laws, then we'll all be in a better place. But disability justice recognizes that you can have the best laws on the planet. You can even enforce them. How's that for an idea? Have them, enforce them. But that still doesn't mean you've changed anything, because you cannot legislate morality at the end of the day.
Right.
We've had the ADA now for more than 3 decades. We've had the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act now for almost half a century, same as the Rehab Act. And yet we already know that ableism, both structurally as well as interpersonally, is all pervasive in this nation. Ableism is in every single aspect of our society and our polity. And so trying to simply change the social condition for disabled people by changing our laws and our policies locally or nationally is not going to get us to the end goal of liberation. That's what disability justice seeks. Liberation from ableism, from white supremacy, from capitalism, from every other system of exploitation, deprivation, marginalization, and oppression. And to get to liberation requires us not just to contend with law, but to contend with society, with culture, with the values that we hold and the values that undergird the entire framework of the society in which we live. Values about people's worth and values about certain people as not human, as expendable, as disposable. The work of disability justice is so much more far-reaching than the work of disability rights. And that is the only place where the future of our community can go.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar intro to the disability movement as Lydia, in that I had only been exposed to disability rights, and that was the only framework through which I could view anything. And I was thinking, we need to make more laws, we need to make better laws, at the same time as, you know, I wasn't getting my needs met on disability services, even though the laws were sometimes great. And there was that disconnect. And I got out of it this new framework through which I look at the movement, and I'm a much better activist and a much better person and friend for it. I think another thing I got out of Lydia's class is a friend and mentor. Lydia and I had been friends before I took their class. I met them at a conference because they were swearing at the presenter because the presenter was saying some bullshit on disability employment. And I went up to them afterwards and was like, I know who you are. And I really liked that. And then we were connected, and then I took their class. And I think another thing it did was the class was a space for community building for the students. I met a lot of other disabled students. And at the time at Georgetown, I was founding the Georgetown Disability Alliance, which is a place where disabled students can connect for advocacy, for community building, for mentorship. And the classroom space was a really important place for that. And I think we were really able to learn from Lydia in terms of their activism experience and also connect with other communities on campus. I remember once, halfway through class, Lydia had us all get up and go to this sit-in that the Black Survivors Coalition was holding in the Georgetown President's office. And that was a fantastic opportunity for cross-movement coalition building because a lot of survivors are disabled. And I think there's not enough of that in a lot of disability activism today.
So is there anything else that you would like to leave our audience with right now? Because we're getting ready to close this discussion.
My hope is that if you've been listening to this conversation and you're thinking about what you can take from it, take this. Justice is not optional. There is nobody who is not worth it. And that also includes you.
And on that note, with love, thank you very much, Lydia.
History won't forget us or try to minimize our pain, and so I.
You. So I also did we'll have a conversation in a couple of minutes about what Lydia shared with us, but I did a little more research to just try to hone in on some key principles of disability justice. Lydia was also is part of this group called Invalid, and I believe might have contributed to what is 10 Principles of Disability Justice. And I have the book and excerpted from it these 10 principles. The book is Skin, Tooth, and Bone, The Basis of Movement is Our People, a Disability Justice Primer by Invalid. And so if you reflect on what Lydia talked about, intersectionality was the first principle. And that principle says, we're many things, and, that everything we are impacts us. The second principle is leadership needs to happen from people who are the most impacted. We're not looking for academics and experts to tell us what is what. When we talk about ableism, racism, sexism, transmisogyny, colonization, police violence, et cetera, we are lifting up, listening to, reading, following, and highlighting the perspectives of those who are most impacted by the system we are fighting against. Anti-capitalist politics. They say the nature of our disabled body minds means that we resist conforming to normative levels of productivity in a capitalist culture. Our worth is not dependent on what and how much we can produce. And Lydia's parting comment, justice is not optional, and everyone deserves it, right? Kind of underscores that third principle. The fourth is cross-movement solidarity. Disability justice can only grow into its potential as a movement by aligning itself with racial justice, reproductive justice, queer and trans liberation, prison abolition, environmental justice, anti-police terror, deaf activism, fat liberation, and other movements working for justice and for liberation. The fifth principle recognizes wholeness, that each person is full of history and life experience. Each person has an internal experience composed of thoughts, sensations, emotions, fantasies, perceptions, and quirks. Disabled people are whole people. The sixth principle is about sustainability, that we learn to pace ourselves individually and collectively to be sustained over the long term. The seventh principle is a commitment to cross-disability solidarity. They say we value and honor the insights and participation of all of our community members, even and especially those who are most left out of the political conversations, those who are marginalized at the margins, right? The eighth principle is about interdependence. They see liberation of all living systems in the land as integral to the liberation of our own communities, and we all share one planet. Oops, sorry. The ninth principle is around collective access, creating and exploring ways of doing things that go beyond able-bodied and neurotypical norms. Access needs aren't shameful. We all function differently depending on context and environment. And the 10th principle is collective liberation, moving together as people with mixed abilities, multiracial, multigendered, mixed class across the sexual spectrum with a vision that leaves no body, mind behind. And if we remember, Citizen Network International is a world where everyone belongs, right? And the last little bit I want to share with you before I open it up to discussion is just excerpted from the work of a person by the name A.J. Withers from Canada, in a book called Disability, Politics, and Theory. It's actually the end of A.J. Withers' book. The chapter is called The Radical Disability Model. And it's very interesting to me because Withers takes what Lydia has talked about, and in that chapter, they just bring it into kind of a socio-political and economic kind of discussion that reinforces everything pretty much that Lydia just talked about. So the radical model defines disability as a social construct that's used as an oppressive tool. It's interesting because Withers talks about a social construction of disability, meaning that a person is only disabled if their impairment is not accommodated, is rejected. They reject that idea and saying, no, that social construction is actually used as a form of oppression to penalize and stigmatize people who might need access or assistive technology or that accommodations. There are 4 key concepts in the model. The first is disability is not separate from other forms of oppression. It interlocks and overlaps them. The radical model of disability says what is considered normal is arbitrary and requires deconstruction. Up until this point, all of the models of disability have failed to challenge supremacy of the norm. And this model rejects the social model's distinction between impairment and disability. The third is the disability label is used to marginalize specific types of people in order to obtain and maintain power. And the classification of disabled is a political determination, not a biological one. And the fourth is that accessibility cannot be addressed universally. It must be approached holistically. Access needs to be addressed collectively across bodies, boundaries, and borders. Radical access means acknowledging systemic barriers that exclude people, particularly certain kinds of minds and or bodies. And radical access is not about universal design or universal access. That's an arbitrary and fictional concept. And in the chapter, Withers talks about universal design being a construct that is inaccessible oftentimes. So there may be a wonderful building in Finland, I believe, is the example that they use. But if I can't get to Finland, I can't take advantage of that universal design. So it really is a political and cultural construct that needs to be taken throughout. So this is from Sins Invalid as well, this image of disability rights or civil rights, hashtag disability justice, a world in which this is their tagline at Sins Invalid, a world in which every body and mind is known as beautiful. And I just would like to leave you with important leads and reads. Withers' book, visiting Lydia on their website, and also Sins Invalid.